Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to give us all a couple more minutes to give some time for others to join us, and we'll get started in 1 to 2 minutes. So hello again, and good afternoon to everybody who has just joined us. Welcome to the Trustees Conservation in Action webinar series. My name is Jennifer Dubois, and I am the interim managing director of conservation here at the Trustees. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you're excited to get an in-depth look at land conservation here at the Trustees. Each one of our 122 properties has its own unique history and treasures to offer, and our team of stewards, curators, ecologists, land conservationists, and many others all play a role in bringing these environments to life. Today, you will hear about the work that we are doing in land conservation at the Trustees. These efforts would not be possible without the support of our donors, and we cannot thank them and you enough. When the world went virtual more than 2 years ago, we launched a new online program like this webinar series in order to stay connected to our members, visitors, and supporters. We have since found that our online webinars help us reach a broader audience, including those who have gained a renewed appreciation for nature and getting outside. I hope these webinars will inspire you to get out and explore a trustee's property and help you learn about our many new projects and initiatives. We believe this work will help us all get the next generation outside and build the trustees of the future. Thank you again for supporting our mission to protect and share the places people love. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. You can submit questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Tom and I will pause for questions after we are done. And next to the Q&A button, you will see a live transcript option. If you would like to enable closed captions to appear at the bottom of your screen, please select live transcript and show subtitle. Thank you very much. So without further ado, I will get started. So I am going to speak about land conservation at the Trustees, give a kind of 101 introduction to land conservation, and then pass it over to Tom O'Shea, who is our Vice President of Conservation and Resilience, who will talk about emerging trends in the land conservation movement. And I am sitting here at Powysset Farm in Dover, and Tom is at the Doyle Conservation Center in Leominster, two of the Trustees properties. So we first are going to talk about the who, what, where, when, why, and how of land conservation. and the common land conservation tools that you may have observed already, and we'll talk a little bit more about. So those are property acquisition, which is for the trustees, are reservations, conservation restrictions, which I'll go into in more detail. And then there are leases and easements, stewardship partnerships, assist. So when the trustees or other organizations partner with each other or with public agencies. And then a concept that's called buy, protect, sell, which is often done with farmlands. And it's a way to make farmland affordable. So a land trust may purchase a property, protect it with a restriction, in many cases an agricultural restriction, one that makes it affordable and requires that the farm must be farmed, and then sell it at its restricted value. And that's one way to make farms affordable. So before we get into the two most common land conservation tools, property acquisition and conservation restrictions, I just thought I'd do a little kind of breakdown of how, what tools we apply most at the trustees. And this chart actually shows you our active land conservation projects at the trustees. So the first two categories are what we call our Elliott Initiative and RPL. So the Elliott Initiative is an effort we have to identify the best candidates for potential new reservations. And then the RPLs are our reservation priority lands. So those are properties, unprotected properties around our existing reservations, where protection of those properties would enhance or protect our reservation further. The next two categories are the CR, which is short for conservation restriction, and CR amendment. So conservation restrictions, again, I'll talk more about those soon, but they are forever. They are permanent conservation tools. And every once in a while, we may amend a conservation restriction. And we only do that in cases where we are strengthening the conservation values or adding more conservation benefit to that existing conservation restriction. And the trustees, we have been protecting land with conservation restrictions for over 50 years. So you can imagine, as properties may change hands, there may be new owners. The documents themselves have evolved over time. So there are sometimes opportunities over long periods of time to be able to enhance and improve a conservation restriction. Also, well, actually, before I go there, we have our community garden work. That's the trustees' work, mostly in Boston right now, where we have our urban community gardens. Some of the trustees' reservations have come about through leases or stewardship partnerships, which was the next column. And then the last two columns are the Hilltown Land Trust. Some folks may know that the trustees are affiliated with the Hilltown Land Trust, which has a 13-town project area in Western Massachusetts. And we have a strong partnership with the Hilltown Land Trust. So they also have projects of their own, and sometimes they also partner with the trustees to protect land. So just a few examples, actually leading right off with, I wanted to show an example of a Hilltown Land Trust project. So this is an active project where it's 130 acres at the corner of Goshen, Conway, and Williamsburg, where the Hilltown Land Trust will be acquiring the property. And the landowner's wish was that the property be forever protected. So sometimes in cases like that, we will also have another entity hold a conservation restriction. So in this case, the trustees will be holding the conservation restriction while the Hilltown Land Trust will own and manage this property. Another example is a recent community garden. These projects are often very unique in that they are partnerships with the city of Boston, and in some cases, partnerships with developers. So there could be a case where a portion of a property will be developed. In this case, Parker and Terrace Street, we have the right side of the property, the 28,000 square foot parcel, is planned for redevelopment. And as part of that redevelopment, the trustees will be getting the land on the west side on Parker Street. And that land, almost 30,000 square feet, will become a community garden. An example of a lease, some folks may or may not know that some of our reservations came to the trustees as leases or partnerships or agreements. Westport Town Farm is one of those, where the trustees has a 99-year lease to with the town of Westport to manage the Westport Town Farm. And then another example actually is Tully Lake Campground in Royalston. The trustees leases Tully Lake Campground from the Army Corps of Engineers and manages that property as an active campground. And then just two examples of some of our more unique approaches to conservation and to our work. The first being De Cordova Sculpture Park and Museum in Lincoln. So this property is owned by the town of Lincoln, and it still is to this day. And the trustees have an operating agreement with the town, and have integrated the entity, De Cordova Park and Museum, into the organization as a trustees reservation. So this is more of a quite complex tool that we utilize, but this is a way for the organization to have a broader reach, to work in new communities or deepen our relationships in communities. And then another example is Armstrong Kelly Park, which is an 8-acre property in Osterville, in Barnstable. And the Cape Cod Horticultural Society approached the trustees to work with them to fold this property and their entity into the trustees and our work around gardens across the state. So while these two examples we have pursued these reservations because of their partnerships and their ability to connect to new audiences, there is still a land conservation component when we pursue projects like this. So the bulk of the rest of my time, I'm going to talk a little bit more about land acquisition and conservation restrictions. So this map shows our 122 trustees reservations across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We have 122 of them. And then the yellow circles show trustees conservation restrictions. So we have over 350 conservation restrictions across the Commonwealth. And in many cases, you may see overlapping yellow dots. And that is because we may have done a conservation restriction. We may have worked in a community in a landscape that has multiple landowners who were willing to convey conservation restrictions to the trustees. So it is a tool to kind of build and protect larger landscapes. So when land trusts are looking to protect land or to put, to do outreach into the community, most land trusts will either have a geographic focus or a strategic focus, or both. So many folks probably have a town-wide land trust. Maybe it's all volunteer or staffed in your community, or a regional land trust that might, there might be structured based on a watershed or a county. But in addition to that, organizations will usually have a more defined and strategic focus. So whether that's to protect farms, forests, scenic landscapes, water resources in urban areas, community gardens and parks, and perhaps one of the focus area is public access and recreation, and also cultural and historic, a focus on cultural and historic resources. So here at the trustees, I just put up our mission statement because this gets to part of our strategic focus. So our mission, as you probably all are familiar, with is that we protect for the public's use and enjoyment places of exceptional scenic, historic, and ecological value. And I underline scenic, historic, and ecological because those are three important areas for our work and on which our organization was founded. Now, an organization such as the Trustees, being statewide with multiple types of landscapes across the state, and also an organization like the Trustees that has been around for multiple generations, we certainly have found that our land conservation work does evolve over time in response to the changing community around us, and that is an important factor that Tom will actually be speaking about a little bit later on today. So whether it's a conservation restriction or a property acquisition, a property that's going to be acquired by the Trustees, there are a few different ways that can happen. A landowner, whether that landowner be a private individual, a family, another nonprofit, a town, may look at a donation of the property. And for private individuals or families, there could be tax benefits to donating your property. Another kind of hybrid option is a bargain sale. So perhaps there is some funding that is needed, that there is some financial need. So the Trustees could have an agreement with the landowner to purchase the property or the conservation restriction at a bargain sale. So that is at a price that's less than what the property could be sold for on the open market. And then the maximum being a fair market value sale. And the Trustees, as a nonprofit, we do in some cases purchase properties at fair market value. And when we do, first, those properties must be of utmost priority for the organization. We must be able to raise the funds from private or public sources to be able to purchase the property. And we also must make sure that we are not paying more than the property is worth, more than the appraised value. And then the last kind of common conservation tool, as I've mentioned, I gave examples of already, are these partnership agreements. And from this perspective, organizations sometimes will partner together, or the Trustees with a municipality, to work on purchasing a property either at bargain sale or at fair market value. So when we are looking to acquire a property, and actually in any case, anybody that we work with must be a willing landowner. We work with people and families and entities who share our vision of conservation, who share in our mission, who are like-minded. And we always work on cultivating those relationships and take very seriously the priorities and the needs and the wishes of landowners. The other who of property acquisition is the land trust, whether it's the Trustees or your local land trust. It could also be a public agency. It could be the town in which you live. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts also has a handful of agencies that will protect land. The Department of Agricultural Resources, Department of Conservation and Recreation, and Mass Wildlife are the most common. And then, of course, when you're acquiring property, the other big player would be private and public funders, especially when you're talking about a bargain sale or a full fair market value purchase. And just one note there is when the Trustees acquires a property, we aren't only responsible for the purchase price. We have transaction costs to be able to acquire the property. And we also take a very careful look at the commitment we are making to take care of a property. And we want to make sure at the outset, when we are initially planning that purchase, that we are raising sufficient funds to ensure that we can take care of that property well into the future. So oftentimes, the purchase price for a property is only a portion of the overall fundraising goal that we may have. So the whys of of property acquisition for many organizations. Again, I'm giving the trustees' perspective on this, but this is also kind of more broadly within the conservation community, that organizations will acquire land for the purposes of passive recreation so that you can invite the public onto the property so that they can engage with nature. A second why would be to manage resources. There are organizations that are focused, for example, on active forestry management. So the New England Forestry Foundation is an example of that. A third why acquire lands would be to protect certain resources, whether they be water resources, ecological resources, cultural or historic resources. And then finally, land trusts and any nonprofit for that matter can accept the donation of real estate that may not have conservation value or conservation benefit to the organization, but where a landowner is interested in supporting the organization. And they may have, let's say, a house or a vacant lot. Again, a property that may not make sense for the organization to own and manage and consistent with its mission, but that owner may choose to donate the property to the trustees or another entity with the intent that the property would be resold and the proceeds would be utilized to support the mission. And those types of projects are very individualized, very specific to the landowner and their wishes. So at the trustees, we do property acquisition mainly to acquire new reservations or a new community garden, to enhance a reservation. So that's way back in the beginning, I gave the example of a reservation priority land. So there are lands around our existing reservations that we look to acquire, and also trade lands. So I just thought I would talk through one example. Because many of our reservations, you may go out and walk a property or visit a property, and it may not be immediately evident that that property was created and built upon over time. In this case, at Pegan Hill in Natick and Dover, over many years, over decades, if you will. So the main part of the Pegan Hill property was first acquired through 3 transactions in the 1950s and the 1960s. And then in about 2015, and I should say that those first 3 transactions, they were donations. The 3 individual properties were donated to the trustees. And then in 2015, the trustees, partnering with the Dover Land Conservation Trust, protected 2 parcels, one in Natick and one in Dover. And the trustees added 15 acres to the Pegan Hill Reservation. And then the Dover Land Conservation Trust acquired the parcel to the south called Lewis Hill that it currently owns and manages. And you'll see there's actually a trail that connects the 2 properties. And then most recently, just last year, another landowner donated 33 acres of a property that has now been added to the Pegan Hill Reservation. And if that wasn't enough, if that wasn't exciting enough to make an 84 acre reservation, next door, we have the Mumford Wildlife Forest, which is owned and managed by the New England Forestry Foundation, but over which the trustees has an agreement to manage trails, again, connecting New England Forestry Foundation's property with Pegan Hill. And that allows us to expand public access. So if I haven't emphasized it enough already, partnerships in many different forms are just so critical to the work that we do, not just at the trustees, but across the Commonwealth. So conservation restrictions, this is, or a CR. This is a protection technique that can be used to protect private properties. It can also be a partnership between a municipality, a town, a land trust, and in order to have different layers of protection. But you always have a landowner, and a grantor, whether that's a public or private entity. And you always have a CR holder or grantee, which it has to be in Massachusetts a qualified land trust or a qualified public entity that can hold these restrictions. In Massachusetts, we have a statute, a state law that enacted conservation restrictions and that put guidelines on restrictions and allowed for these restrictions to be perpetual. And all of our conservation restrictions adhere to that. And then kind of the other who of a conservation restriction are the approval entities. So the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs must approve, review and approve each and every conservation restriction that gets recorded. And then municipalities, in the municipality, the select board must sign off on the conservation restriction, on the public benefits of the restriction, and the local conservation commission must sign off on the public benefits. Now, none of these three entities are privy or party to the restriction itself, but because the conservation restrictions, the state statute that I mentioned, kind of qualified these restrictions as being in the public benefit, we need to demonstrate that each and every time we are completing a conservation restriction. So when I talk about conservation restrictions, or when I've been talking about conservation restrictions for the last 20 years, I always use the bundle of sticks analogy, which some of you may have likely heard of before. So when you acquire and own a piece of property, you can think of your ownership as a bundle of rights or a bundle of sticks. Some of those sticks could be the right to build a house, subject to town zoning and building codes, to cut down trees, to dig holes, to stockpile different materials. And when you convey a conservation restriction, what you're doing is you're taking some of those sticks and you are kind of giving them up, if you will. The conservation restriction holder does not necessarily own those bundle of sticks, but the conservation restriction itself is separating those sticks from the rest of the sticks that the landowner owns. And when you put a conservation restriction on your property, you still have the right to live there, to convey the property to whomever you wish, and to enjoy your property. So to go into that a little bit more, with the components of conservation restriction, every single conservation restriction has these bulleted points. The first being the conservation of values and purposes, second being prohibited uses, third being reserved rights, and then some restrictions go a step further and have affirmative obligations. So those agricultural restrictions that I mentioned earlier, in many cases, those agricultural restrictions that are intended to protect farmland have an affirmative obligation for the landowner to continue farming on the property. And there are various mechanisms that can be utilized to ensure that. And then the other piece that I want to highlight is that each and every conservation restriction is specific and unique to the property, to the landowner, to the conservation restriction holder, to that situation. So examples of conservation values, and these are also commonly called the public benefits of a conservation restriction. And this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the common conservation values or public benefits. So those could be protecting scenic resources, protecting biodiversity and habitat. Perhaps it's a specific species of plant or animal, or it could be vernal pools, the protection of open space. So properties that are adjacent to other protected open space have a public benefit. And what's becoming more utilized and more evident over time is looking at the conservation values that protected open space has for climate resilience. So keeping land natural and in its unbuilt state provides resilience to climate change. Another conservation value may be the protection of farmland soils. So in specific farmland soils that are most commonly known to best support to crops and agricultural activities. And then finally, cultural and historic resources. So conservation restrictions don't always just protect the land. Sometimes they can have structures, whether they're protecting historic structures or whether the property itself, the land itself, is a cultural or historic resource. So then the next part of every single conservation restriction is the list of prohibited uses. So again, this list is not exhaustive. This is just kind of a highlight, if you will. But the first and foremost is subdivision of a property. Second, the development or building of structures or certain types of structures, extracting gravel or other minerals, dumping or polluting, damaging or removing vegetation, be it trees or shrubs or other critical vegetation, and the use of motorized vehicles. Again, those are just some examples. So then, and those are the bundle of sticks, if you will, that the landowner is putting into the conservation restriction, is giving up, if you will. And then the reserved rights, these are the list of the sticks, if you will, that the landowner is keeping. So some examples, again, not exhaustive, but could be the right to cut firewood, the right to maintain or create new trails on your property, the right to conduct agricultural activities, the right to remove invasive plants, or the right to build specific and limited structures. There are conservation restrictions that might have building envelopes. So we identify a specific area where you might want to, let's say, build a shed or a barn, or in some cases, a house in the future. But the overall intent here is that you are protecting the larger landscape of your property, and that these reserved rights, the sticks that you're keeping, are not running counter to the conservation values or the overall public benefits of doing the conservation restriction. So I just thought I'd just put a map up here of a conservation restriction, just for a way to convey some more information about them. So this is actually a 100-acre parcel that's on a pond. And as you can see, one of the main conservation values was the protection of the water resources and the pond frontage. Another one, as you can see, is the assemblage of farm fields. So the protection of agricultural resources was a value here. A third was the protection of scenic resources, because this property slopes down to the water, and there are just some really amazing views from across the pond. Now, in the case of this conservation restriction, this was a private landowner that donated the conservation restriction to the Trustees of Reservations. And he actually kept out the right to build 2 additional houses. So that's why some of those lines, the lines on the property may look a little disjointed, because we, working with him, selected the sites that we felt were the best out of the way, if you will, that allowed him to be able to retain those rights for children, to be able to build houses, but also would be consistent with the conservation values that we were trying to protect with this project. And then I just wanted to mention that Haskell Public Gardens is another example, because many folks may know it as a trustees reservation in New Bedford. And if you haven't visited, I encourage you to go there. It's a 6-acre property. It might be small, but it's mighty. And it's really just an enjoyable place to go. But I wanted to use this as an example, because this is a property the trustees purchased. We purchased at a full fair market value. But in order to protect this property and to raise the funds necessary, and because we wanted to be a part of the community, we partnered with the city of New Bedford. And the city of New Bedford applied for funding that actually put a conservation restriction on the property. So the trustees conveyed a conservation restriction to the city of New Bedford, in exchange for funding. They purchased the restriction, if you will, and that brought funding to the project. And just throwing up a little map here to prove another point, or to show another point, and that is that even seemingly small parcels that may have a lot of infrastructure are still worthy for conservation. In this case, there are historic buildings on the property. That was a conservation value. A second conservation value was the open space nature of the property. The back of the property is very open, which for this part of New Bedford is uncommon. And also one of the public benefits here was public access and was management by the trustees as a park. So we were specifically calling out the nonprofit ownership of this property as a reason for doing this conservation restriction. So just to show that, conservation restrictions most commonly are a tool to protect private land, and private land and public access isn't required on those conservation restrictions in those properties, but it can also be used as a tool to facilitate partnerships between multiple organizations and as a way to build a project. And before I pass things over to Tom, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the trustees are celebrating our 50 years of conservation restrictions. And we have over 350 conservation restrictions with over 400 owners across the Commonwealth. We have a wonderful team led by Sally Nazer, who is our conservation restriction program director. And this team of individuals really embodies the work of stewardship and of relationships, because especially with conservation restrictions, it feels like a lot of work when we're drafting restrictions and talking to landowners. And once we finally record that restriction and we've protected the property, it's fantastic and it's wonderful. That's also the beginning of a forever partnership, whether it be with that landowner or with successive landowners. So the relationship pieces and working with landowners and future owners, it's so very critical to the work that we do. And we strive and we do our best to maintain positive working relationships with our conservation restriction landowners. And Sally and her team have just done a fantastic job cultivating those relationships, offering most recently programs. In addition to this webinar series, Sally and her team offers educational webinars to all of our conservation restriction landowners. So it's really a highlight and a hallmark of the trustees land conservation program over the years. And is one that we really invest in because it is we have this long-term lens. It's not just protect the property and move on, whether it's a reservation or a CR. We are invested at that property in that community forever. So with that, I am going to hand things over to Tom to talk about emerging trends in land conservation.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks everyone, and appreciate everyone's participation and attendance to our presentation on land conservation, which, as you all know, for the trustees is a core part of our mission, who we are, our DNA going back to the original inception of the trustees. And we are in a very unique moment in time as well in our history, because not only are we just finishing a major strategic plan and campaign, but we're moving into a new leadership transition, and there are many other, trends and opportunities that are shaping how we're thinking about the next phase of land conservation. So I just want to, kind of give everybody a sense of what's out there. It won't be an in-depth review, but sort of a cursory high-level review of some of the trends that we're seeing and how that fits and aligns with our priorities as an organization. So the next slide, I'd just like to show you, Jennifer, if you can advance the slide.
Working on it.
Sometimes they need to be warmed up.
There we go.
We Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, we have been thinking about a number of reports that have come out over the last few years that are setting a lot of broad goals and are providing great background and information to, provide the strategies and the reasons and the rationales for those strategies in land conservation in Massachusetts and even more regionally in New England. So we're certainly looking at those reports, and I'll be showing some of those goals in the slides to come. This is an important part of our work, and Jennifer, you can move to the next slide, as we begin to think about our priority areas. And some of the things that we are seeing as evolving trends and themes externally that relate to our work and our mission is, one, just the loss of natural areas. And we know that, there's a housing shortage. There are continuing development of natural areas for solar arrays. And there are plenty of other things that are concerning us in terms of the future of our natural areas and our lands. Natural climate solutions, you heard Jennifer talking about the need for nature and climate resilience, as well as carbon and mitigating the atmosphere by sequestering carbon. Biodiversity protection. We often talk now about carbon and climate change, but the loss and erosion of biodiversity continues. Farmland, farm access, especially when we think about food security going forward, and also the conservation of those lands and all the values that they provide for us, and security of local food. And this is a big part of who we are as the trustees, as well as a significant farmer in Massachusetts. And then the urban outdoors and forest, the need for nature and equitable access to nature, particularly acute in our urban areas where heat island effects and other climate change impacts, flooding, and just access to nature, is so important for people's well-being. And then also the potential for sequestering more carbon in our urban forests. So we want to talk about those evolving areas and some of the goals that are being set by various organizations. The development trends, looking at Mass Audubon's 2020 Losing Ground report between the 5-year period 2012-2017, should come as no surprise that Central Mass and Southeastern Mass are seeing some of the highest rates of development at that time. And I think that's continuing. And as we look at a lot of the information, we realize that there's a need to update much of these maps and this information, but I think those trends are still continuing. Essex County also up in the North Shore. If you go to the next slide, I wanted to point out that some of you are probably aware during Governor Baker's administration that they created a housing choice initiative. And this is really a program with grants to incentivize municipalities to move towards developing more housing, given the housing shortage. And so when they set those goals, the governor at that time in 2016 or 17 said, we want to get 17,000 new housing units each year, so that we have 135,000 by 2025. And the state's been actually on track with those goals, as you can see here. So that will continue. And I know that, in some communities are pushing more on this than others, but this will be a tension point with conservation in some places. Next slide. So I also want to say that during that same period, 2012 to 2017, that I showed you earlier from the Losing Ground report with the map of development trends, you can see that on average, looked like about 5,000 acres per year were developed. Another 6,000, not another, but that included 6,000 acres of forest loss. So why the difference in that 1,000 is probably because some of it turned into open land, some became developed for solar arrays. During that period, around 6,000 acres alone were lost to solar array generation. Then overall, the good news was 20,000 acres per year were conserved for a total of about 100,000. Now, if you look at different sources, you're going to find different rates of conservation, and for different time periods, anywhere from 14,000 or 10,000 up to 20,000 in conservation. So, there's a lot we could look at, but generally that's the ballpark. We were outpacing development, which is great. Then if you look at some of the goals being set with the Resilient Lands Initiative with the Commonwealth, 20,000 acres per year is the goal that they've set going forward. The Clean Energy and Climate Plan is looking to do 25,000 acres over until 2050. So that's a real increase. And then the Wildlands and Woodlands report said we needed to step up conservation to 34,000 acres per year. So that's quite an ambitious goal. So they're all coming at this from different perspectives. The Clean Energy and Climate Plan is looking largely at how, we're sequestering carbon and contributing to net neutral or net negative situation for the Commonwealth in helping its meeting its net zero goals. So, these are just giving you a sense, and it doesn't seem that those goals are too far from what we've been doing over the last decade. If you go to the next slide, there's been continuing emphasis around, protecting natural areas for their ability to store carbon from the atmosphere. And, to the extent that we can keep our lands in natural condition, they have that power to not only provide many, many other benefits for us, but certainly help to mitigate climate change. So in this, you'll see that these are sort of the major types that that were analyzed. Forests are the second highest per acre, and then wetlands, particularly coastal wetlands, have some of the highest rates of soil carbon storage and carbon storage in general. So, when you're thinking about where do you want to invest in terms of that aspect of carbon sequestration, forests and wetlands are certainly important. Farms are as well, and urban areas are going to be a big part of that equation. I know that the Clean Energy Climate Plan calls for 64,000 acres of riparian and urban tree planting by 2050. So go to the next slide. I'll just give you a little bit of the sense of the trustees and our goals, where we're at and what we own. You can see that most of our carbon sequestration per year is in the growth. This is just growth, not in the forests themselves, but what they add each year in growth. Forests are by far the largest, and it's also because we owned about 18,000 acres. Salt marshes are quite large, given that we own about 1,500 acres to 2,000 acres, and then our ag lands provide a fair amount as well. So that's an important part of the trustees being carbon negative and continuing to go into a carbon negative pathway in the future. Go to the next slide. We looked at coastal habitat with UMass, and we found that there's still a fair amount of salt marsh, coastal dune, coastal beaches that still are not protected. And this is particularly important for salt marsh, which is an area where if you don't actually own or have some agreement on the salt marsh, you don't have the potential to restore it. And you need to restore it to keep pace with sea level rise or allow these salt marshes to migrate. So that's going to be a real continuing focus, I think. And we talked about the importance of coastal wetlands for carbon, but also biodiversity and the importance for a healthy ocean and coastline. You go to the next slide. Biomap 3 from Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife laid out some goals for protection and what still needs to be protected for core habitat. And these are, areas of exemplary natural communities and resilient ecosystems. So still there's a lot of work to do left there in terms of biodiversity protection. Farmland changes. Farmland has been, relatively in good shape, though it is, a slow decline over time. This is from our agricultural census information. If you look at where most of our farms are, you'd be surprised that most of them are actually in central to eastern Massachusetts. You just looked at Worcester County, Bristol, and Plymouth alone, you're close to around 40%. So when you think about those development rates, there's going to be a lot of pressure, continued pressure on farm and development of farms. And then, with urban outdoors, and we're looking at gateway cities here, and in particular, you can see some of them will have above state average growth rates. Some won't, but others will. And regardless, these areas are ones where could really benefit from continued greening of those spaces, whether it's for heat island impacts, urban recreation and outdoor recreation, but really important for also climate change with increased storms and flood resilience. So I think for us as an organization, we've been very focused on Boston, but we will need to think about how us and other organizations can work in other cities across the state. So just some, quick summaries here, and I know this was fairly quick to go through, but just that, continuing a focus on urban areas and even in renewed focus on areas outside of Boston will be important for us to take a look at. I do think that, it is ambitious with those conservation goals, but I do think increasing the pace is possible with a great collaborative effort. And nonprofits are a piece of that, but municipalities, state agencies, the conservation restrictions on private lands, those will all be continuing sources of continuing that conservation pace. We, the trustees, have some gaps in Southeastern Mass and west of 495, and we'll want to take a closer look at the opportunities there. Likewise, I think there's an opportunity for landscape scale forest conservation, which is going to be critical for a number of things, whether it's biodiversity or carbon, certainly for outdoor recreation. And, our relationship with the Hilltown Land Trust is one model for helping to develop those kind of landscape scale projects, but we can't do it alone. I think we're going to have to think about doing this as an entire land conservation community. Solar siting policies and incentives, I think we've got to really work on that so that we can slow that loss of land to solar arrays. So that's an area that we've been working on the policy front. I do think the trustees have an opportunity to do even more with a statewide coastal marsh strategy that includes both acquisition or CRs and restoration, and working with our partners across the state to do that. I think we could be a real national leader there, and really highlighting the importance of protecting our marshes for blue carbon and biodiversity, and really creating a vision for, I think, other states as well. And then lastly, I'll just say that, the buy, protect, sell model that you heard Jennifer talk about with private farmland protection is always an option for us. We need to be targeted and think about how can we help in this area. Is this leadership opportunity for us as a farming organization? And even further, can we help to provide access to historically disadvantaged farmers or young farmers that don't have the capital to get access to farmland, and continuing, future generations of farmers? So there's a lot there for us to work through. We are working on a land conservation strategy white paper to understand what those opportunities and emerging trends are, and hoping that will shape our future land conservation strategy. You go to the next slide. Just, you're going to probably wonder where all the money will come for that. I mean, there is some great new federal funding sources, and I'm sure that with the state developing an environmental bond bill, will provide additional funds. So there's a lot of this will flow through the states and some directly from federal agencies, but there's a lot here for us to think about to develop a land conservation strategy around in terms of funding. And the last slide, I believe, is just to end on our mission and thinking about, how do we talk about exceptional in terms of those new trends and needs and issues that are facing us, and really the future of the state and our conservation, future. So I do think that, we have an opportunity here to maybe reinterpret and expand the definition of what it means for exceptional scenic, historic, and ecological value. So I'll end there, and I know we don't have a lot of time for questions, but we'll stay as long as any of you are able to, and I'll turn it over to Javon, I think, for questions.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer and Tom. We do have time just for a couple questions here. So if anybody else has any questions, please submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. To start us off, how long does it take to acquire a property or CR?
Oh, that's a good question. It much like I said before, it's very individualized to the property and to the situation. I've had property donations that have happened in as short as 2 months. And let's see how long I've been working in the conservation field, 21 years. I've had projects that still haven't been completed. So it really does vary. It depends on the individual situation, but keeping those relationships going over time with landowners is critical.
Wonderful, thank you. Another one here is, do property donations have expenses related to them?
Yes, so just like I explained at the end how property purchases or accepting or owning property has expense to it when a property is being donated to us, we do have our due diligence expenses. And we also will work with a landowner, with a donor, if they are interested and able to make a monetary donation to help us care for the property. That is certainly more than welcome and helps us to accomplish our vision on the property. So yes, there are expenses.
Wonderful. And I think we just have time for one more question. And it's a two-part. So how do projects get funded? Just a recap of that process. And also, what's the best way to reach out to you if you had any questions about this and land that could be donated?
So, well, I guess let me answer the second part first, and then Javon, I'll ask you to repeat the first part. But sure. So the on the trustees website, there's contact information there. Anyone is welcome to contact. We have a land conservation team. So in addition to me as the interim managing director, we have 2 land conservation specialists, Marianne and Olivia, who work on projects. And then Sally Nazer and her team, she has 3 people on her team who mainly do the conservation restriction monitoring, but also help with developing new projects. So we are more than happy to talk to anybody who's interested in donating property or a restriction, seeing if it meets with our mission and our focus. And if not, we're always happy to try to connect somebody to another organization if it's not the best fit.
Perfect. Thank you for that part. And then the first part is, how do projects get funded?
Yeah, so that the last slide that Tom showed with all those millions and billions of dollars, there is funding at federal level, there is funding at the state level. Some municipalities have Community Preservation Act, so the public funding tends to come through the either federal, state, or local funding agencies, and then the trustees will sometimes have a private component where we are embarking on a fundraising campaign to also raise money from private sources, individuals, families, foundations. So it for the larger the project, the more funders and the more types of funders there are.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again to both of you. Tom, if you could conclude the webinar today. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you. No, I appreciate everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. And just so you know, for all webinar recordings in this series and to register for future webinars, just please visit the trustees.org/webinars. And again, everything you heard about today would not be possible without our donors, and especially top supporters like our Founding Circle members. If you are not yet a Founder Circle member and would like to find out more, please visit our website or give us a call. So thank you again for joining us today and for investing in our mission and for believing in a brighter future. Thank you.